Hey friends, in the last set of chapters were discussing about the wolves and why you think Peter Brown decided to include the wolves in this story. And a lot of you were saying, for like the bad guy element, right? That there's this other problem. And I know we've talked at school about books that are much longer, big chapter books, having lots and lots of little problems along the way. So I agree. I think Peter Brown included the wolves because makes the story more interesting when there's a lot of little problems leading up to this kind of big event. So our big event is obviously Roz running away, escaping, and will she make it? So let's jump back in and see where we get today. Chapter 58 is called The Cabin. So remember, we were last time in this cabin, and I was wondering if it'd be safe there. We'll see. The hailstorm was brief but violent. Its icy stones were quickly melting away. But the damage would linger on. The valley was littered with shredded leaves and wildflowers. Wounded animals were hobbling back to their homes. Several unlucky birds lay limp in the grass. Inside the cabin, Roz was standing by the window. She held Bright Bill in her arms. Her bruised body was wrapped in an old blanket. The robot knew everything there was to know about caring for animals, but all her son needed was time. His injuries would heal on their own. "Go on without me, Ma," said the goose in a weak voice. "I'll catch up when I'm feeling better." "That is ridiculous," said the robot. "What kind of mother would leave her injured child behind?" "But, Ma—" "Stop talking," interrupted Roz. "You need to rest." Brightbill tried to argue, but he was already falling asleep. The cabin was simple, just a square room with a wood stove, 2 chairs beside a table, and a couple of cots rotting in the corner. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on a shelf. Otherwise, the walls were bare. It was clear that no humans had been here for a very, very long time. The whole place had a foul odor to it, though. Lumps of feces were strewn about, and little footprints trailed away from a dark hole in the floor. Roz leaned over the hole. "Hello, is anybody down there?" Something moved, and then a pair of shining eyes looked up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said a voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." "I'm sorry to intrude," said the robot. "My son and I were only trying to escape this hailstorm." "Your son?" said the voice. "Is that him in your arms? Let me see." Very gently, the robot lifted a folded cloth and revealed the sleeping goose. "He must take after his father," said the voice. "He's my adopted son," said the robot. "My name is Roz, and this is Brightbill." The shining eyes blinked. "You're Roz and Brightbill? The birds have been singing about you for months. You're living legends." "Technically, I'm not living," said the robot. "You seem pretty alive to me," said the voice. "Either way, nice to meet you. They call me Sprinkles." With that, the creature crawled up through the hole in the floor. She was covered in black fur from her nose all the way down to the tip of her fluffy tail. Well, except for those white stripes running down her back. You see, Sprinkles was a, can you guess? Skunk. The robot took one look and stepped backward. Sprinkles frowned. "You know, Roz, skunks only get stinky when we're nervous." "Are you nervous now?" "Well, sort of, but in a good way. I'm honored to meet you. Please pull up a seat and tell me what brings you here." Sprinkles hopped up onto the table and listened as Roz described their journey. The skunk was a great listener. When Roz spoke, Sprinkles nodded politely and said things like, "Oh my, is that right? You don't say." This went on until Brightbill began to stir. "Ma, I'm thirsty," he whispered. "There's a creek right out back," said Sprinkles, and those might be useful." She motioned to the bowls on the shelf. "Please help yourself to anything. My home is your home." It turns out skunks can be quite hospitable. It's a big word, hospitable. It means that they're welcoming into their home. Sprinkles invited the visitors to stay as long as they liked, and so our friends spent Brightbill's recovery in the cabin. The goose mostly slept. The robot brought him water and food. The skunk made sure they were both comfortable. A few mornings later, sunlight streamed in through the window and onto Brightbill. He was squawking and waddling and fluttering through the cabin. His injuries had healed, and he was eager to continue their journey. "Thank you for everything, Sprinkles," the robot waved as she marched away from the cabin with her son on her shoulder. "Glad I could help," called the skunk. Misunderstood creatures like us got to look out for each other. That's going to be one of your questions. Misunderstood creatures like us got to look out for each other. What does that mean? Who's misunderstood? Who do people not understand? The skunk's referring to herself, and she's also referring to Bright Bill and Roz. Chapter 59, The Strange Wilderness. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains. Here and there, the sun broke through the clouds, and bright streaks came shining down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over a rugged mountainside and found our friends. For a moment, the robot and the goose basked in warm sunlight. Then the patch of light moved on and rolled into the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. A patchwork of large boxy structures was nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up from holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout the mountain range were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like, "No trespassing, no hunting." It seemed humans had once lived and worked in this wilderness, only to leave it behind. In places, though, there was still activity, robot activity. Armies of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels and built new dams and worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings and hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and then went on their way. Excuse me 1 second. I got a new water bottle since we've been gone. You guys would have to help me find that over and over and over again. If we were in the classroom, I'd lose it. I'd leave it here. But now at home, it stays right with me. Chapter 60, The Hunters. Crack! A shot echoed into the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into that wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, and had traditional weapons for sport. Crack! Roz and Brightbill were desperate to stay clear of hunters. However, this was proving difficult. The trees were tightly packed together, and the undergrowth was tough and tangled, so they followed the deer paths that cut through this part of the forest, but they never knew when or where a next shot could be fired. The shots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard. And then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! They heard the noise whiz through the undergrowth, and a deer went running away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. He was scared and confused. The young goose fluttered up to a tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in these mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightbill. "And what's it doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe we should just take care of it. Put it out of its misery." "We're here to hunt deer," Hank reminded him, "but it looks like we could have a goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, reader, I'm sure they would have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose, maybe a meal, and they're hungry. The hunter raised his rifle, looking up at Brightbill. He took a breath. His fingers sat on his weapon, and then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind. Footsteps. Something was stomping toward the hunters. The men had hunted all beasts, but they'd never come across this. Well, they didn't know what this was. It was like a tree stump standing on two long roots with branches hanging from its sides. The men stumbled backwards, eyes and mouths wide open. Then they turned and ran. Their terrified noises trailed off through the leaves. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I'm so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You're safe now, I promise." So Roz was obviously in her camouflage, right? She had used that skill that she learned way back on the island once again to keep her and Bright Bill safe. All right. Chapter 61, our last one for today, is called The Guide. So now they're out of another patch of trouble, and here we go. A light drizzle was falling on our travelers, although they weren't actually traveling at the moment. They were standing still and staring up at a steep mountain of rocks. The robot had plenty of rock climbing experience, but one bad fallout here, and she could be stranded forever. So Roz carefully picked her way up the slippery slope, while Bright Bill fluttered along beside. They hadn't gone far when they heard the sound of hooves clattering on stone. Then a horned creature leaped out from the mist and smashed into the robot. Clang! Roz went flying backwards. Clang! Raj crashed to the ground. Standing on the rocks above the robot was a ram. He had big, curling horns and a crazy look in his eyes. Bright Bill flew to his mother's side, ready to defend her. Stay away from my mama, he hissed, spreading out his wings. But rather than charging, the ram hung his head and started to cry. Oh, I'm sorry, he blubbered. I don't want to hurt anyone. Sometimes I just lose control and I smash things. I feel awful about it. I really do. Roz brushed herself off. I believe those are your instincts, she said. We all have them, and they can be very powerful. I only hope your instincts do not end up breaking me. Don't worry, the ram sniffled. I'll try not to let my instincts break you. I appreciate that, said the robot. My name's Thud, said the ram. Which way are you headed? Why is Thud a good name for the ram? What's your other question? Be thinking. We're trying to find our way out of these mountains, said Roz, but they never seem to end. You're almost there, said Thud. Let me show you the way. It's the least I can do after smashing you. The ram pranced away and led our friends to a narrow path that wound up the rocky mountainside. Raj tried to stay close, but Thud was born to climb. He easily scrambled up steep slopes and vanished into the mist. A minute later, his friendly voice called out, For a creature without hooves, you're not a bad climber. And there he was, peering down from a cliff ledge. The path opened onto a foggy meadow where a whole flock of wild sheep were grazing. They reminded Roz of the cows grazing in the pasture, and she wondered how Hilltop Farm was doing without her. Thud pranced through the flock. These are my new friends, he announced without stopping. They're lost, so I'm guiding them out of the mountains. The sheep raised their heads. Thud had a habit of making weird friends, but these two were definitely the weirdest. The flock watched as the ram, the robot, and the goose continued up the mountain and disappeared into the mist. Higher and higher they climbed, above the tree line, to where only rocks and scrubby plants and trickling mountain streams were. They occasionally came upon a dirt road or hiking trail, and then the ram trotted across casually, while our friends crept along cautiously. At one point, the ram got a crazy look in his eyes. His horns came flying at the robot, and she jumped out of the way just in time. Then Thud cried and apologized for his instincts. Roz forgave him, and the whole group carried on again. They finally hiked up from the mist and onto the mountain ridge. Above, the sky was clear. Below, a blanket of puffy clouds spread outward in every direction. The sun was setting, and the western clouds were burning pink. Roz thought of the mountaintop on her island. If only she could be watching the sunset from that peak instead of this one. But they still had a very long way to go. Thud pointed our friends to one last path. This will take you down from the mountains and through the foothills, he said, smiling. The ram suddenly got that crazy look in his eyes, and the robot prepared to jump. But this time, Thud pulled himself together. He said goodbye to the travelers, and he pranced away. Okay, friends, so you're going to answer my questions for today about that comment from Sprinkles, about how they have to stick together, misunderstood creatures, and also, why is Thud a good name for the ram? Can't wait to see what you say.